And this is a direct result of this bargain that was effectuated in the 1950s. And so when you see Black Americans in Africa, perhaps you can be critical of them, or critical of those who toe the line with regard to U.S. imperialism, but you should also be aware of the fact that this is not an accident, that this is not coincidence. To the extent that we can embarrass and undermine the neo-colonialists, the imperialists, we can extract and exact more concessions, meaning a better standard of living for the oppressed as we seek to redistribute the wealth, for example, from top to bottom, as opposed from bottom to top, which has been the historic pattern. Well, possibly it can be both. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. That is to say, as U.S. imperialism is declining, it will fight tooth and nail, hammer and tong, to maintain its preeminent position. And as such, that could mean, at least in the short term, more death and destruction. As we say on this side of the Atlantic, a beast is oftentimes most dangerous when it's cornered. At the same time, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that there are ever stiffer challenges, as you suggested, not only from the usual suspects that are focused on in this country, Russia and China, but as you mentioned, Turkey. Turkey, as you probably know, is the power behind the throne in your neighbor. Speaking of Somalia, it's taken a role with regard to mediating between Ethiopia and Somalia with regard to Ethiopia getting a port. This is nothing new in the sense because we recognize that for centuries, the predecessor regime, the Ottoman Empire, was heavily influential for centuries, up until the conclusion of World War I, more than a century ago, when the Ottomans were on the losing side, so to speak. And of course, U.S. imperialism feels that it has an advantage because it feels that it can manipulate the population of African descent. Advantage. And there is something to that, I'm afraid to say. I mean, interestingly, and this is something that all of us should think about. If you look at the U.S. military now, which inevitably will be playing a leading role in terms of the preservation of U.S. imperialism, it's now headed by men of African descent on both the military side and the civilian side. On the civilian side, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. On the military side, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the overall U.S. military, C.Q. Brown. In terms of AFRICOM, the Africa Command, which focuses on the continent, Lieutenant General Michael Langley. Also, interestingly enough, when just last year, the High Court in this country sought to invalidate what's called positive discrimination in some parts of the world, affirmative action in the United States, that is to say, taking into account racism and white supremacy and limiting the life chances of people of African descent in this country, they carved out an exception for the military, interestingly enough. You can continue to pursue affirmative action in the military academies, West Point, which trains officers for the Army, the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, training officers for the U.S. Navy, the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, which, as its name suggests, trains officers for the U.S. Air Force. Now, as a person who is now working on a book that deals with Northern and Eastern Africa, I've taken note of the point that, for example, in Morocco, at a certain point, and this was not unique to Morocco, I only mention that because I just finished reading a book about it. At a certain point, the rulers decided to conscript even free Africans to be in the military. And of course, some of you may be familiar with the Mamluks. You know, the North Africans, they would train these black armies, and then the black armies would say, wait a minute, maybe we should be in charge. Now, I'm not suggesting that Lloyd Austin and Michael Langley and C.Q. Brown are going to say, wait a minute, maybe we should be in charge. But I am pointing out this dynamic that I'm sure the leaders of U.S. imperialism are aware of, but they don't have that many choices right now. And so therefore, in a sense, they have to take chances and roll the dice. And in light of that, I think that it's possible that both of your propositions have correctness attached to them. That is to say, that U.S. imperialism is in crisis, I would say terminal crisis, but at the same time, that does not mean it's turned into a pussycat. As a matter of fact, it's turned into the opposite. That is to say, a tiger, which will inevitably go down fighting. Well, rather than psychology, let me speak to ideology. And in speaking to ideology, let me speak to a point that led to my transition from being a lawyer to a historian. That is to say, when I first got involved in history, if you look at the books that I began to write in the 1980s, for example, most of them dealt with this transition away from U.S. apartheid in the 1950s, as U.S. imperialism once again was in crisis because African nations were surging to independence. Caribbean nations with Black majorities were surging to independence. The United States wanted to maintain influence in these lands, not least because of investment opportunities and natural resources and cheap labor and all the rest, but found it difficult to do so because of U.S. apartheid, because African students would travel to the United States. Of course, the 44th U.S. President, Barack Obama, his father had roots in Kenya and traveled to the United States in the late 1950s to matriculate at the University of Hawaii, and then fathered a child who became president of the United States. And so these African students, particularly if they were going to the South, the headquarters of U.S. apartheid, they'd be treated atrociously. They'd be treated terribly. And that was no way to win influence amongst Africans. And so the U.S. State Department, which runs, of course, foreign affairs, at one point they came up with an idea of giving the African students a lapel pin, a pin they could put on their lapel that would allow them to enter restaurants and check into hotels, unlike Black Americans, for example. But, you know, Black Americans are rather crafty and savvy. So we would immediately begin counterfeiting those lapel pins and, you know, speaking with accents so that we could too gain access to restaurants and hotels, for example, and wearing perhaps shirts like this, so that we could pass. So that didn't work. And so finally, the agonizing decision was made to move away from the more egregious aspects of US apartheid, or Jim Crow, as it was called. But this came with a heavy price, because what happens is that the trade-off was tossing overboard the most sophisticated and internationalist-minded Black intellectuals and leaders, including the late, great Paul Robeson, who I wrote a biography about, but you should look him up if you're not familiar with him, because he's a prototype of what I'm describing. Perhaps at one time the best-known Black American, if not best-known US national, a star of stage, screen, multilingual, spoke dozens of languages, which allowed him to communicate all over the world. And of course, he was targeted along with his comrades. And so what that has created, even to this very day, is a Black community that is not very internationalist or not very globally minded, I'm afraid to say. Interestingly enough, one of the most significant developments of the past few centuries is the rise of China. Black Americans have hardly anything to say about that. They have hardly anything to say about Russia, the Ukraine conflict, hardly anything to say about the crisis in Venezuela, the attempt to overthrow the Maduro regime. And this is a direct result of this bargain that was effectuated in the 1950s. And so when you see Black Americans in Africa, perhaps you can be critical of them, or though critical of those who toe the line with regard to US imperialism, but you should also be aware of the fact that this is not an accident, that this is not coincidence. As they say in certain parts of this country, when there's a crisis and the wolves are pursuing, you begin to throw comrades off the dog sled and let them be gobbled by the wolves. And those liable to be thrown off the dog sled are people like myself, for example, or Black people in general. In other words, the conditions that led to that bargain in the 1950s are rapidly evaporating. But since also part of the bargain was a kind of induced amnesia, that is to say, a reduction of historical memory, to the point where people, or many people, are not even aware of how we got to this point, which makes it difficult for them to combat the toxic impact of the current moment. What's interesting, at least in the United States, is that that particular approach is taken towards people of African descent. It's taken towards the descendants of the original inhabitants of this continent. Speaking of the indigenous folk, for example, were liquidated, subjected to genocide. But within the ruling class and within the broader society, in light of the fact that the Jewish Americans have been integrated into the US ruling class, nobody comes to Jewish Americans and says to stop talking about the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, if I were to say that, I'd be called a bigot. I might even lose my job. So this is obviously a one-sided approach. And of course, you have many Irish Americans who walk this fine line because they want to reproach London. At the same time, of course, London is a close ally of US imperialism. But at the end of the day, they have latitude as well to talk about their struggle against London. And so you really shouldn't take that argument very seriously. You should only take it seriously when it's directed across the board. But it's not, and it will not be, because the reason why there is a kind of gag order, as they say in court, where you prevent people from talking about certain issues, is because US imperialism and the colonialists, they find it embarrassing. They find it discrediting, and they don't want to be discredited. They don't want to be embarrassed. And I'm sad to hear that some of your comrades go along with that, because they're basically carrying water for their enemies. They're basically doing the job of their antagonists. And they're basically undercutting themselves, because to the extent that we can embarrass and undermine the neocolonialists, the imperialists, we can extract and exact more concessions, meaning a better standard of living for the oppressed as we seek to redistribute the wealth, for example, from top to bottom, as opposed from bottom to top, which has been the historic pattern. So I'm not sure how long we should dwell on this subject, because it seems to me the answer is obvious. Well, it's a struggle. It's a struggle with ups and downs, but I would like to think that we are on an incline, heading up. That's what I would like to think. I mean, to address pointedly what you just raised, of course, there's an African Continental Free Trade Area that's trying to develop a common market of the 4 dozen plus sovereign independent African nations. Actually, just in a few days, there will be a meeting in China with many African leaders and heads of state, meeting with the comrades in China with regard to developments. And so it's an uphill climb, but I think that with sound leadership and the ability to execute sound diplomacy, that is to say, not getting enmeshed in Washington's latest harebrained scheme, which is a new Cold War with regard to China, avoiding those sorts of pitfalls and looking at the long term, on the long term horizon, I think that it's possible to foresee steady progress. Now, that may be difficult to see at the moment, as you see people marching in the streets of Nairobi and Abuja, as you see the conflict racking the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, the conflict with French neocolonialism, US imperialism, for example. And by the way, with regard to the latter, do not be fooled by propaganda, because US imperialism propaganda, to the contrary, is not necessarily opposed to alignments with religious zealots, so-called Islamic fundamentalists, if that's in their interest. They've done so repeatedly over the decades, even though it's backfired. For example, on September 11, 2001, these erstwhile comrades attacked New York and Washington, for example. But once again, I think with deft diplomacy, deft political leadership, we can surmount these hurdles, surmount these barriers for the benefit of our people who have been suffering for much too long. Well, the problem oftentimes for leaders is not emulating a 6-year-old with attention deficit disorder. What I mean by that is being distracted by the latest shiny object or by the latest frivolity. That is to say, that the alliance of Sahel states should not be distracted by the maneuvering of US imperialism and French neocolonialism, they should seek to heighten ties with friends in the neighborhood, in Asia, in Latin America, for example. And as a special note, as a person who holds Cuba dear to my heart, I would encourage our friends to welcome health brigades from Cuba, literacy brigades from Cuba, because they specialize in that sort of thing. And obviously, a healthy and literate population can be quite formidable in terms of undermining US imperialism and French neocolonialism. And I would also like to bring coals to Newcastle, as they say in England. That is to say, salute our friends for doing what I've just been suggesting. In other words, obviously they don't necessarily need advice from some professor in North America, because they've been doing precisely what I've been suggesting. For example, in terms of our friends in Niger, seeking to get higher payments from the French in terms of the uranium, this major resource, and then of course more revenue coming into Niger means more to spend on education, more to spend on healthcare, etc. And also, of course, they don't have to get involved in the internal affairs of Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire or other leaders of ECOWAS, because the people of Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire are clamoring against the policies of their governments that are all too friendly towards the antagonists, speaking of US imperialism, French neocolonialism in the first instance. So I think that what our friends need is our solidarity. What our friends need is our ability to restrain the aggressive impulses of the North Atlantic powers, which history has shown are not opposed even to imposing fascism in order to execute their diabolical schemes. And so, as much as counsel to our friends in Africa, I think our counsel should be directed more to our friends outside of Africa, particularly in the citadels of imperialism. Well, I mean, let's talk about this concretely. I mean, you have a European Union, for example, which is a pan-European body that seeks for Europeans to circle the wagons so that they can more effectively deal with US imperialism, their ostensible ally, and then their ostensible antagonist, speaking of Russia and China. Once again, why don't these people who complain about Pan-Africanism, why don't they complain about Pan-Europeanism? I mean, for example, obviously it makes no sense. And when we're talking about Pan-Africanism, we're talking about the African Union, for example. We're talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, for example. We're talking about the Caribbean community, the Jamaica, Barbados, the sons and daughters of Africa who were ripped away from the continent because of the malevolence of the unlamented African slave trade, are now leading independent countries, now trying to broker agreements with the African Union, for example, so that they could more effectively stand up to US imperialism, to the European Union, for example. So Pan-Africanism is moving ahead, irrespective of the naysaying of the critics, irrespective of people who don't even recognize it when it's staring them in the face, for example. So I'm not sure how much of our time we should devote to this, only to ask that the critics be even-handed and to begin to issue broadsides against Pan-Europeanism, for example. Or there's, of course, Pan-Asianism as reflected in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, spearheaded by Indonesia, one of the major political formations and trading blocs on planet Earth. There's an Organization of American States headquartered in Washington, which suggests that it's basically a puppet of US imperialism insofar as it excludes Cuba from membership, but we will change that eventually. So why should there be all of these regional blocs, except in Africa? Well, there are many, but what came to my mind is what I'll repeat, which is without struggle, there's no progress. With regard to an issue, particularly for our communities to discuss, is something that's been written about voluminously, perhaps most expertly by some of our Caribbean friends. I'm thinking of Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That is to say, the dialectical connection between the rise of capitalism, the rise of the North Atlantic countries, and their exploitation of Africa, not least through the African slave trade, which my ancestors experienced. I happened to be around in the 1960s, and I considered myself a freedom fighter then, as now. And I would have said then, as I would say now, is to broker alliances, broker anti-imperialist alliances. Don't be distracted from anti-imperialist alliances. And I would say then, as I say now, that victory is certain.